So how can marketers convince other business stakeholders to take a greater interest in their data?
I can give you another scenario here because I do think that, I think marketing is very important. And if you don't have it, then you won't get nothing else really happens, right? Like unless you're piggybacking on a market that's already created. But if you go down just the definition of the term marketing, at least my definition, it's to get other people interested in your product or service. And so marketing is creating a market for what you do. And so if you create a market, it's really expensive to create a market, really, really expensive to create a market. Oftentimes, we're better off instead of creating it ourselves with somebody else's money, like venture capital, we're best off piggybacking on somebody else who created the market, which is why Google, Facebook, and TikTok and other platforms are so valuable, So like if you were to tell like a CFO, hey, I want to create a market, it's going to cost me $1 million. The way you get them interested in that, in giving you that $1 million, if you say, this $1 million will act like $10 million over the lifetime of this thing, right? You have to convince them that it's a return on the investment. Marketers usually look at budget as an entitlement, not as a thing predicted to get a return. Now, the hard part about return on investment is that the timeline is usually longer than anybody wants to accept. I think most marketing aims to have an ROI, but most of it doesn't. And that's not a bad thing. That's like the faith part. Like sometimes you just plant seeds, you put yourself out there, and then years later, it comes up and becomes revenue for you. That happens to me all the time in my business. Like I don't charge per minute to talk to people or to help people with stuff. I'll just solve problems. Then eventually it will pay off. And I know that the more problems you solve, the more interviews you do, the more times you talk, the better off you're going to be and the more that's going to come back to you, right? So you have to realize that not everything is quantifiable, but if you spend your time, probably 20% of your time can be in non-quantifiable things. And the rest of it probably needs to be in something that you can say, I'm moving the goalposts, because people give up faith. Like faith has to be a continuously renewed thing. And so if you always say, hey, I did a bunch of podcasts, eventually they're gonna make, what did the podcast pay off? Did this pay off to do these interviews, right? Well, you have to have some kind of thing to fall back on then and say, okay, yeah, I think this one did, or this one, the rate, or you estimate the rate of payoff of being on somebody's podcast or per appearance, right? And I think that's really the value that you get.
I remember, a while ago, Rand talked about the power of serendipity. So it's sort of like, this immeasurable force where, you might meet someone at a conference and then years later they might talk about you to a different brand. But also to your earlier point, I kind of liken it to an expense line on the P&L. You don't question rent, you don't question electricity. So marketing could be viewed in a similar light. It's a means to get you somewhere. It's a necessary evil, and it's not always going to return ROI in a exact scientific manner, but it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing is, can't be like a blank check. I think a lot of marketers think that it should be a blank check with no accountability. And then they're like, well, you can't assign accountability to something that we can't measure, and they hide behind that. There's definitely a happy medium between, again, going back to my earlier point, being too data driven and being too opinion driven. Neither of those things are good.